I would like to scan all of you in this room, one at a time. I must remind you that the scanning experience is usually a painful one, sometimes resulting in nosebleeds, earaches, stomach cramps, nausea, sometimes other symptoms of a similar nature. At this point, I'd like to call for volunteers. Fine. Just, sit right here, please. Now, I'd like you to think of something specific.
Do I have to close my eyes?
It doesn't matter.
All right, yes, I have something.
The mind force. Scanners. Their thoughts can kill. Ten seconds. The pain begins. In your flesh. In your brain. 15 seconds. You can't breathe. It chokes you. It destroys you. 20 seconds. You explode. Experience the terrifying power of scanners. Their thoughts can kill. Rated R. Restricted. Under 17. Not admitted without parent. There are 4 billion people on Earth. 237 are scanners. They have the most terrifying powers ever created. And they are winning. Scanners. Their thoughts can kill. Scanners. Rated R. Under 17. Not admitted without parent. There are 4 billion people on Earth. 237 are scanners. They'll control your mind, conquer your will, and manipulate your body like a toy. Experience the terrifying power of scanners. Scanners. Their thoughts can kill. Rated R. Under 17. Not admitted without parent.
One of the first things we shot in Scanners was the scene where she's scanned by a baby. Jennifer O'Neill is in the doctor's waiting room, and sitting next to her in the waiting room is a pregnant mother, and suddenly Jennifer O'Neill's character starts getting a headache, and then she gets a nosebleed and realizes that this, not the mother, but the unborn child is scanning her from the womb. And that's how big this outbreak has become. That was, to me, the most subtle kind of thin end of the wedge that, something was beyond our control. And that's what I liked about how David conveyed this power.
He's very quiet, very calm, has a very dry sense of humor, and he's very, very open to suggestions and so on. So it's really great to work with him, because you just start with like an idea, and then you develop and you go through many stages and so on and so forth, where you finally get to know exactly what he was thinking, which direction he was going, because sometimes he doesn't quite know until he sees something.
I first met David Cronenberg on Scanners, and I flew from Los Angeles to Montreal, where the production was already in gear, and they were moving ahead quite rapidly. And it was sort of a descent into madness for me, because Scanners was a very hectic production. There was a lot of spontaneity and changes. David was having to accommodate for a lot of production pressures that were forced upon him.
And knowing the tax credit situation in Canada, the first 3 quarters of the year, all the potential investors were making money, and by October, November, and December, they would then commit to financing. So we would all be kind of lurching at the end of September. Is the money going to come through? And then, let's shoot, spend the money, go.
I was really, really sort of taken aback when I saw just how crazy the picture was going. But he wasn't just a director who could handle the pressure. He was a director who still had his vision through all this insanity, just the technical day-to-day production craziness he had to get through. He still was doing it to follow through on the vision he had, which was really cool to see.
David was pretty receptive to ideas. It wasn't a closed door situation. And as we got into the movie, I didn't care if he kept changing things. David was right about what he perceived. And he had a certain mindset about what his goals were.
He was changing things as he had to, moment by moment, and he was rewriting the script through most of the evenings at the end of production. So it was a real eye-opener for me to see somebody who was really capable and really smart at what he was doing.
David really wanted a very visceral, live quality to everything. And we were having a lot of problems trying to do certain things. And that's when I said, we're just going to really have to bring in more muscle, talent, to achieve some of these results. And I suggested Dick Smith. So they said, well, if you can encourage Dick Smith to come, and if he'll meet our budget, we would love to have him.
Dick invented his own ways to do things, and I think a much better way to do things. It was a different time, and Dick was pretty much a one-man show, and he did everything out of his basement laboratory in his house in Larchmont, and it was a little teeny basement. It was not big by any means, and it had a very low ceiling, and it was packed full of stuff.
He just pioneered so much stuff, from the sculpting part to the application and different separating a makeup in different pieces and the coloration. He was always coming up with some new stuff, and everybody just learned from him, and went on from there. That's why he's like a great inventor. He's a combination of a fantastic makeup artist and mad scientist.
You could stand right next to what he created and not see the delineation of lines. It was that fine. He really mastered this tissue paper thin skin and capturing all of the pores and the hairs, and he would literally lace hairs for hours through little thin, delicate appliances that were feather thin. And then these were bonded with different adhesives that we worked on so that everything moved in a natural way.
So we went down to visit Dick, and all this fascinating stuff that was downstairs, like Linda Blair's head from The Exorcist, and then he was suggesting doing this and that, and a whole list of material that we had to buy while we were in New York. So that's what we did, came back to Montreal, and then they hired a third person, which was Chris Wallace from Los Angeles. He was the one who had the most experience with foam latex and, monster things and stuff. So it was great. It was kind of like a mad frat house of special effects makeup.
The way Scanners came to me was I was actually working at another shop in LA, and Dick Smith called up. I was literally shaking answering the phone because I had never spoken to Dick Smith before, and he was the god of makeup. And so he said that he was advisor on a show that was shooting in Montreal. They needed somebody there right away. Could I jump on a plane and get up there and help them out for a few weeks? The script was changing as I got there. I literally, was reading through it, and I'm going, well, what about this? And I go, no, we're not doing that. We're not shooting that. We're changing that to this. And so it was hitting the ground running for me, and fortunately, Stéphane Zupuy was there, a very, very talented makeup artist. Was not that experienced at the time, but, when you're good, and he was good.
Gary Zeller was the special effects man. And, Gary's an original. He's a chemist, so he knows all about all these different products, and the stuff that he comes up with is like really fantastic.
I'm a material scientist steeped in polymer chemistry and plastics engineering, and I excelled in creating formulations. And that was kind of what happened on Scanners, because way back in the day, most makeup artists just continued to use just basic latex rubber. But we moved into a higher order, a higher caliber of sophisticated materials, silicone rubber materials. Dick Smith was pretty much the first to move into that area. And I had the contacts and the people who I could talk to get scientific information and how to do modification to these materials. So we were fortunate to create these new substances that he was very pleased with.
Gary Zeller, he's an eccentric character, very knowledgeable, and he was basically, I think he was brought on board as the pyro guy and wound up doing a large amount of other stuff on the show as well. He was very good about making you aware of what he was doing, which is what a pyro guy has to do. Pyro guys need to educate a film production crew more than anybody else doing their job, because their work is so critical and potentially dangerous. There was a scene where Gary had to blow up a gas station, I think it was, in the movie. And we were out on location, he'd done all the rigging, and there was quite a crowd watching. And the fire went up, and he had, I don't remember the number of, say, 4 major explosions to go off. And they went off 1, 2, 3, very dramatic. The crowd was thrilled. It was, 4th of July. Then they cut. And so the crews, the people watching started moving in very quickly. They, wow, let's get closer to this big burning fire. I'm not sure why humans do that, but they do. And Gary was great. He knew there was one thing that had not gone off, and he had to fight to keep those people back. And he did fight, and he did keep them back. And 2 minutes later, a 50-gallon drum flies through the air from another explosion. It must have gone 60 feet in the air.
I've worked with a lot of effects guys whose predictions about how far the debris will go, how big will the fireball be, are either muted somewhat. The frame line is here and they kind of go to there. Some things are wildly off the mark. The tradition is to find out where he parked his car and stand next to that.
This is the fine art of pyrotechnics, knowing when to cut it short and not hurt people, knowing how to make intimate mixtures of chemicals, explosives. And so we were literally, I and some terrific Canadian special effects guys, we were literally making everything on the job, because sometimes Dave would say, gee, you think we could do this? And I would have to go back to the lab, so to speak, and literally compound pyrotechnical devices that I knew that I could have in close proximity to the actor without causing burns or in their hair or their clothes, and to think about take 2, 3, maybe 4.
Just sit right here, please.
signature scene in Scanners where Louis Del Grande, his head explodes. We had a lot of trouble with that. We were trying to blow his head up, basically. And the trouble with pyrotechnics is a squib can blow something up, but it shows a spark. And if you want this kind of mental pressure, you don't want to see that there's an ignition in it. Even though there's two or three frames you could cut out, it would still work. But Dave wanted this thing, and we couldn't get it quite right.
Originally, that was not regarded as a high point item. And so, you know, the approach of, well, we'll make a head and we'll blow it with air, we'll give it a pneumatic discharge. And basically all that happened was we got this ballooning head that just looked ridiculous. And, you know, we went in circles about this.
We did a plaster head, which of course looked like a plaster head or a statue exploding. Of course, that didn't work. Then we did a wax one. Well, flesh is kind of flexible, and that looked exactly like a wax head exploding, although there was a lot of blood and gore.
We took a life cast of Louis Del Grande, and we made a gelatin positive in the mold and lined that with a plaster sort of inner support skull for it. And that was then packed with various materials. Most of these were materials that were just excesses from the lab. There were some latex scraps, there's some wax, and just bits and bobs of a lot of stringy stuff that we, you know, figured would fly through the air a little bit better.
We filled the head with literally leftover burgers and so on, you know, because we were living on that crap. And so we just threw it in there with a bunch of like caro syrup blood and pieces of gelatin brain and so on. And then we sealed it with wax.
The hands on the table are casts of these hands. The gold ring, I think, was a last second emergency thing where we got to the set and realized he was wearing a ring. It was, I think, that was made out of mortician's wax and a gold wrapper out of Stefan's cigarette case or something like that. But, and we took that to the set. It was going to shoot on the original set, and then everybody realized that it might make too much of a mess. So it was shot later on, actually after I'd left the production.
We shot it initially in I think, a Concordia University lecture room. So we took the back wall and a few side walls, put them in a warehouse down on the waterfront in Montreal. So it was basically outside. It was in a warehouse, it was freezing. And all the trucks were out there, and nobody could get this thing to explode properly. And Gary Zeller finally said, okay, here's the deal. I'm through screwing around. Everyone, roll your cameras. We had 4 cameras on it. And then get inside your trucks and close the windows.
Gary took a big shotgun and lie down behind the dummy, pointed it like right there, and then he blew the hell out of it. And that's what you see in the movie, and it worked great.
I don't know if it would actually fly in this day and age, you know, to actually shoot a shotgun on a set somewhere, but they did, and it blew up really cool.
We settled on kosher salt. That was the best material for us. Just chunky salt particles that were kind of crystalline and not too reflective, so it couldn't read too well. And then when we blasted at it with this high pressure shotgun shell filled with the kosher salt, everything just shot all over the place and it looked fabulous. If ever you want to blow up a head, I advise using kosher salt, but don't do this at home.
So when we finally screened the dailies of the exploding Louis Del Grande's exploding scanner head, the producer Pierre David was enthused and appalled at the same time. He said, "It's incredible, unbelievable. We'll get an X. We have to reshoot it. We can't use this." And nonetheless, what was in the final film was that exact footage. Even though we reshot it 3 times, it was never as perfect as what was shot originally.
Where's Kim? The next room. She'll be awake in a few hours. We don't want anyone in here with us. This is just between you and me.
For the end sequence, the scan-off between the 2 brothers, we actually shot in one of the former pavilion, I believe it was the Italian pavilion, on the Man in His World Expo site in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. That was designed to be a summer fair, and it was. Shooting in literally the day before Christmas, lots of freezing people, lots of breath. We had to redo things. That scene was eventually reshot in the same place in June the following year.
The reshoots were pretty rough because everyone's tired and, oh, we're over budget and all that sort of stuff. And if we didn't get this in the can, and if we don't do it right, you don't have a movie.
All right, we're gonna do it the Scanner way. I'm gonna suck your brain dry.
Chris Wallace was terrific. It was just wonderful to work with him and Stéphane Dupuis. And we, you know, when you work long hours like these guys, with their head down in the molds and they're nodding out on the bench because they're so tired and the coffee's getting darker and darker, you know, they did a terrific job. But they needed reinforcement because the job became almost overwhelming. That's when we brought Dick Smith in, and we had to do reshoots because those scenes were very critical, and we really had to redo a lot of stuff.
The end that you see in the movie, that was manufactured by Dick Smith. So Dick Smith took over, and that's where he invented like these Elvisite bladders and those veins popping up and all that stuff.
Dick did these really interesting effects where these veins would appear on the scanner's face when they did it the scanner's way. Those were achieved by this material that is called Elvisite. It was I believe it's some sort of vinyl. But what Dick would do would be actually make a plaster mold off of the part of the person's face. And in that mold, after it's released, paint in layers of this Elvisite, this plastic, which you paint in a layer and it would dry, and you put a little more in it would dry. And then he actually had pieces of rubber, thin pieces of rubber called dental dam, that he had put release agent on, and it was cut out in the shape of these veins that he wanted, and kind of put that down on the Elvisite and then paint another layer over it and another layer. And what that actually did was then create a space in these, sandwiched in between this Elvisite, which you could pump air into or pump blood into, which is what he did in the case of scanners. And it would inflate and swell up and distort and look like this vein growing on his face. And eventually it squirted out at points. And I think that actually came about. I don't think that was in the original plan. I think it was just that they were supposed to swell up. But in order to get the blood to flow through that channel in the appliance, you had to punch a little hole in the top to get the air out. So then once the blood reached that point, it would squirt out. And I guess Cronenberg, being the strange, twisted man that he is, like that.
You had arms with strange things happening. You had bladders and peculiar things all over people. He wanted, like, right in front of the camera, big open flames. He said, quote, "I want to feel the heat." And at that point, we realized that, gee, this is a little bit more than makeup and just a flame bar down below the chin, you know?
David wasn't afraid to ask for things, because directors always want more, and Gary wasn't afraid to bring it. In fact, his contribution to the film business, the Zell gel that allows you to set people on fire and it won't soak through, you can put it on skin and it won't burn them.
Cell gel doesn't burn. It just protects you from receiving a burn. It's a shielding chemistry.
We had to now have a real actor in one position, Stephen Lack, replaced by a full-on puppeteered mannequin made up to look like him, but which would catch on fire. I believe the eyes explode. I forget all the gory details, but that was quite elaborate to light something that's made out of skin and then suddenly cut away and come back to the same person, now rubber. The rubber surface itself, it doesn't have any depth behind it. There's no blood, there's no muscle. It's just an outer layer. And quite often it'll be too smooth. And we try to talk to makeup and the AD and the director to understand that this actor should have a little oil, a little sheen on his face, and that's what we can put on the prosthetic version, the rubber version. So in this case, we lucked out, and Stephen Lack had, we were kind of prepped his facial features to match the prosthetic.
Those were really difficult scenes to do. There was a higher level of professionalism with Dick and all, and the team was all around. And that really boosted everybody's confidence. It got to a level where there was never a no. And I think that was what was exciting, to feel that the hackles on your back would go up seeing these scenes, you know? And gee, could we take it a little further, maybe?
It was just a question of like getting it right and, you know, getting it on time.
Everybody kept laughing in all the insanity on the show.
And everybody left, you know, with hugs and kisses. That's the way it should be.
Tell us what you did, please, Daryl.
I drilled a hole in the head.
Where?
It's kind of obvious. Right here. I'd been acting for a while. I think it was about my 13th or 14th film at that time. I came into audition for a one-day flashback character in the black and white sequence. In the film, they show Stephen.
People in my head.
And then about a week later, I heard there was going to be more days involved. My understanding was that the character kind of got created on the run. It kind of evolved as the writing came in. And Larry Dane's character was brought down in the storyline. David Cronenberg is brilliant. I mean, when it comes to thinking on the run and being able to be flexible enough to tell these stories like that. Because I remember him making adjustments on set and changing dialogue, changing things. I now watch other directors and writers do that, and they have not been successful. Sometimes they get lost in the forest. David had the ability to change direction and story sometimes, and still keep his compass, his emotional and kind of moral compass and story compass intact. And I got to play this incredible character.
Bring the world of normals to their knees. Rule an empire so brilliant, so glorious, will be the envy of the whole planet.
It was almost like a Che Guevara type character. I saw it as a political statement. You know, society made me the way I am, you know, and they're responsible. I've done over 220 some odd features over the years. I still only work with a handful of directors who I class as not actors, directors, but storytellers who make it safe for the actors. They make it safe for you to take risks. You don't feel like they throw up an umbrella, and David's one of them. And you're playing very bizarre situations, bizarre emotional situations. For me, he created an environment where it was safe to reach for something you might be a little bit uncomfortable doing in a different environment. And being at that time a student of sci-fi, I had no problems translating the idea of an emotional, mental standoff with somebody. That made total sense to me. The idea of being able to blow somebody's head up, that was well within the realm of understanding for my literary background and for what I've been raised on reading and stuff. I was actually never planned on being an actor. I was a writer by choice. I read a lot. My grandfather, my Finley Senior, Finley Ironside, Jock as his friends called him, my dad's father, could speak 7 languages, has his engineering degree and some other things. He was very much into sci-fi, science fiction. He was a member of the sci-fi club back in the 20s and 30s. Friends of his that he wrote with were like people like Frank Herbert. And I read Dune out of a shoebox. It was sent to my grandfather with all the scribblings on it. So I got interested in like some of the early sci-fi through my grandfather. I came from a very poor family. Our house was 12.5 feet wide. I'm very proud. And to be able to escape in books was a big deal for us. When I got the opportunity to read for David, and not so much it was David Cronenberg, I was grateful to work. I've been doing a lot of television. I'd also been doing a lot of crew work, too, anything to pay the bills. My father used to say that I ran away and joined the circus. And he was right. I would do anything to stay around the big top. I would be in front of the cameras, behind the cameras, deliver food. I worked for production services for a while, delivering, grip stands and gels and dollies and stuff, so. Before Scanners, I had seen The Brood, and I'd seen Shearer's. Rabbit, like I said, was a curiosity. I'm from the East End of Toronto, working class. Some people either get into the arts and make it, and some people go the other way. They end up with, a lot of us ended up in prison or in the morgue. So there was some people that had gone that direction that Marilyn Chambers had gone in. And I wanted to see if she could make that jump back into kind of respectability or mainstream cinema. So that was more of a curiosity to me, but The Brood was a brilliant film. It just touches on the dark corners of your sleep that you don't want to look. And then you got Samantha Eggar and Oliver Reed, and it's just wonderful. If you look at the amount of name actors that have kind of come knocking at his door to work with him, quality actors that you would not probably normally see in a sci-fi format, or even in the horror so-called genre. Some pretty wonderful actors and actresses. We talk about Patrick McGowan as being the senior actor on the set and stuff like that, and his run-ins with alcohol and stuff like that over the years are well known and stuff. I found him to be absolutely wonderful. I had a lot of respect for him from his past accomplishments and from The Prisoner, but the real star was the story. I don't remember anyone ever doing any kind of star turn on that set. I remember asking Jennifer O'Neill, I said, "Are you comfortable playing leads?" And she was like, "Everyone talks about Summer 42. I was only on camera 7 minutes," or something like that. And I went, "What?" And she was like, "This is difficult."
Hello.
Something a lot of people don't know about Lawrence Dane is that he had broken his back a couple of years before that and was almost daily in agonizing pain. I remember one day I said to him, I said, "How's your back?" He said, "The only time I don't notice it is when the camera's rolling." To be able to focus that, which he did, Larry Dane as an actor did what he did. He did it really well. He played an inflexible, authoritarian, punishing character. That's not who he was in real life. And Stephen Lack, coming from performance artist, the Rubber Gun Show and some of the stuff he did on Montreal, Maine, and those kind of avant-garde on-the-run films he made in Montreal. Wonderful, cutting edge. Montreal was very avant-garde with his filmmaking stuff. He was much more of an on-camera personality. Now, ask him to do the same thing over and over again. Do it in the master, the close-up, the two-shot, and do it to a script. I think it was a bit of a strain for Stephen.
Keller murdered Dr. Ruth. He deserved to die.
You shouldn't mourn the good doctor's death. You should celebrate it with me.
Dr. Ruth was a great man. He tried to help us. He helped me.
he turned to me one day and he said, "Do you know all the lines?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you know mine?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Can I?" I said, "Yeah, it's okay." Because we were doing something. It was just, you know what I mean? He wasn't trained that way. I'd been trained at the hoop. I did 24 to 30 hours of classes a week for 5 years before I ever got my first real job. A couple of times with Steven and stuff, it's like playing tennis where kind of like you hit the ball and it doesn't go back where you want it to or where you expect it to. It kept you alive all the time. David was very much in charge. I felt like a child who was given permission and the safety to play close to the edge. Like if you're going to run near the edge of the cliff, David will grab you. Don't worry about it. He was the catcher in the rye. There's that scene where I come out and say, "Revic, Daryl, Revic," you know? I remember it was like the first or second thing, and I was like, do I really allow myself the permission to get large, or do I really allow myself to just sort of like show off or something? You know, just, I don't show off, but just don't keep anything in reserve. Just say, this is me, I'm fucking here. I mentioned it to Mark Irwin. Well, I said, I'm a little uncomfortable about just letting it come out. And he said, what the hell? They'll either use it or they won't, you know. Give it a shot. It's for you.
You sound just like him. Like Ruth.
No, not like him.
Like Rack! Daryl Rack! And I remember they called cut, and I didn't look to David. I looked to Mark, and Mark went, like that. It was like I remember that little nod from him, you know, with his beard and everything, sitting behind the camera and stuff like that, going, yeah, that's all right, you know. See, it was kind of like that, you know. You're not alone for that moment, for that a young man, even though I was like in 30, I think at the time, but very adolescent as an actor, very adolescent in my emotions. Growing up in my household, it was not unnatural to have cupboard doors open and close on their own, have TVs shut off up by themselves, and have to get up in the middle of the night and wake my sisters and brothers up because I was having their nightmares and I couldn't get to sleep. I had one brother and one sister who were very powerful, I guess you can say. They're clairvoyant, without any structure or training. I had a lot of stuff that people don't understand. I don't know if this made me perfect casting for Daryl Revic, but what it did is it was not so foreign for me to be a metal saboteur, a kind of Che Guevara of a whole new race, whether it's you're paralleling A.J. Vaught's Slan series, the sci-fi books of the early 50s or not. No, it's just that, I threw a little bit of Ricky in, my cousin Ricky he would do this weird thing where he'd turn his head and the spoons would rattle. And except in David's film, it's not spoons that rattle, people's heads explode. Now, I don't know how many fans know this, but I've said it before. We shot 2 endings, and there was a very pyrotechnic special effect of sparks and all this stuff that didn't work. And the next thing I knew, we got a call and we were going to reshoot the ending, and it was a couple of months later. And what had happened is it didn't work for David, from what I gather. He sent the footage and the storyline, everything to Dick Smith, what I heard. And could you come up with something to give me a powerful ending to this? And Dick Smith had been designing what are called bladders. They're used all the time now. He'd been designing them, and we were going to use them for the first time on all the states. All the states had shut down. So they sent me down to New York, and he did a body cast on me, a facial cast, and he designed these bladders that you see in the film that all fill up with blood, and for Steven too. And that's the first time they had ever been used, was on that film. What I remember of the ending, when Revic's behind that coat, he opens up and you see him with the blue eyes. Those are Dustin Hoffman's blue eyes from Little Big Man. That's what they are. Those contact lenses I have in. The ones that we had that were made to match Steven's didn't work. My eyes had gotten scratched or something. And Dick Smith had a whole collection of false eyes. They were hand-painted, which was amazing for me because he said that a whole bunch of the stuff that Dustin Hoffman did in Little Big Man when he's that old guy sitting there. He's blind. He can't see through the blue scleras that he's got in. They came to me with this idea that they were going to make this Louis Del Grande effigy that I'm standing beside and I'm going to scan, and his head's going to explode. And I said, really? How are you going to do that? And they said, well, there's different ways. We're either going to put explosives in the head or we're going to get a shotgun behind and blow it. And I said, and I'd been around sets and done crew work. I said, so you probably have plexiglass around the cameras and build an enclosure. And I said, yeah. And I said, so the buckshot's going to be flying all over the place. And they said, well, and I said, I'll tell you what, I'll do it. I said, but I want this amount of money and I want this size of an insurance policy, which quickly made them the decision that they were going to do it as a single. You need to see some kind of result from the acting process. The special effects is the punctuation at the end of it. It's almost like, you have a performance and then there's a head explodes. Or you have a little bit of blood run out of a nose. Quite masterful, actually. It deals with political paranoia, it deals with social paranoia, it deals with isolation, it deals with, being alone, apart from, different, afraid. Every adolescent that's ever grown up has felt apart from, lonely, different, afraid. They don't understand me. He gave us, 3 or 4 characters that not only were able to sort of walk around and revel in it, but they could turn it on you. Gave you permission to be who you are. If you're not mainstream, it's okay. You know what I mean? It was cheering for the underdog. Not only gave the underdog, you gave him a weapon you couldn't see. After the last days of shooting, just before Christmas, I went out to dinner with Jennifer O'Neill and her husband at that time. Jennifer was eating dinner and she said, what are you buying the crew for Christmas? And I said, buying the crew for Christmas? I'm trying to steal my wardrobe. Because I remember I was like at dinner with Jennifer and trying to be proper. And her husband said, why are you doing that? And I said, because I got no money. He said, what are they paying you? I said, 5 and change or something like that. And he said, hundreds? 1,000? And I said, no, 1,000, 5. And he was choked on his meal. And that's when I realized, and Jennifer got all uncomfortable. And I looked at him and I looked at her and I went, why, what are you getting paid? And I remember she said a number and I went, a week? You're getting that a week? I wish I'd had a camera on me at that moment, because I know it was a major growing moment for me at the end of that you can actually make a living doing this. The same time I made Scanners, we did visiting hours the next year. I stayed in Canada till 1983, another 2-3 years until I was absolutely broke. I got to a point where I got tired of being offered films for Scale Plus 10, and I went broke trying to stay in Canada. Part of me, I was terrified to leave Canada too. I was frightened to sort of like have to cross the border, and I'd watched people go down to the States and come back with their tail between their legs and stuff. And but I got to a point where if I wanted to stay in the circus, I had to go where the living was being made, and it was not being made in Canada. I literally would do a feature film and then do a lead in a feature film, and then turn around and have to go get grip work or deliver for production services to pay the bills, because you could not make a living. I literally left and had one bag. My first marriage had gone the way of show business. And when I sort of turned my life around, and sort of like that in the early 80s, like 83, 84, I didn't know you could make that kind of money in movies. I was making quite a bit of money, and still do. Great story, I was on Terminator 4 with Kristen Bale, and a young lady who was a PA on the set kept looking at me for about 3 days. I'm sitting with the writers and directors, and looking at the monitors, and we're getting ready for different shots and stuff, and she said, excuse me, Mr. Ironside, are you any relation to the Michael Ironside that was in Scanners? And I said, yes, I am. She went, God, I knew it. Talent must run in your family. And she went walking off, very proud of herself. And I looked over, and the director and the producers were all uncomfortable. And I said, what are you guys uncomfortable about? That was 20. I'm old enough to be that character's father now. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a hell of a compliment, in a funny way. So there's whole new generations coming to the film that ask questions. Or Mr. Ironside, how much social political meaning is in this? You have to attribute David's ability to understand story, because that's what this is. It's a wonderful story. Whether it's Robin Hood and Maid Marian running through the forest, or whether it's Stephen Lack and Jennifer running through an urban jungle. It's a very strong, identifiable predicament that you have your lead characters in. Scanner's an entertaining movie. If you like Anne of Green Gables, it's a good film. If you like sci-fi, it's a good film. If you like westerns, it's a good film. It has a strong opening, a wonderful beginning, you know, it has a follow-through, and it has a terrific end. You know, it's a good rental. It's a good $12 ticket now, or whatever it is you go see in movies. It's a good movie. Good movies stand up.
I was an artist in a downtown scene in Montreal, which was a downtown scene for the whole planet. If you've ever been to Montreal, it's fantastic. And it's got two communities, French and English, and they all meet on St. Lawrence Boulevard, which is the oldest street in North America. That's where we all hung out as bohemians in the 70s. We made a couple of films, Rubber Gun and Montreal, Maine, with my then partner Alan Moyle and Frank Vitale. They were filmmakers, and I knew them from McGill University. I was studying psychology, and but at the same time I was taking night courses in art, you know, painting and sculpture, mostly sculpture. We were bringing Rubber Gun to be screened. It was in the Kansan or something like that, one of those mini fests. So that's what caught David's eye, and that's what got me into the industry. But I didn't do it intentionally. I never studied film. You know, as an artist, every day is, you know, a blank page. And my more premeditated, agenda-driven friends were making films. There's people you talk to, there's people that will make you feel good, and there's people that remind you that you're alive because when you hit them with an idea, it bounces back, you know? So, you know, if somebody throws a rose over the tennis net and somebody hits you back a good ball that you have to return, I would prefer the good ball to the rose. The rose will distract me and I will sniff it, and David gives good ball. So he handed me the script. You know, I sort of thought I understood it. What makes Scanners so great, and what makes almost any work of art great, is resistance. If you don't have resistance, you can't grow.
My name is Dr. Paul Ruth. I'm a psychopharmacist by trade, specializing in the phenomenon of scanners.
Scanners was written, I think, a year or two before execution, and he was about to go into production, and his wife got pregnant, and he conceived the brood, and he went for the brood instead because it was more immediate and exciting. And so Scanners was lying around, and Film Plan had some budget left over and 6 weeks to do something. So they contacted David, and while I was in this other film disaster, which was with Sally Kellerman and John Huston, that film got out of the control of the director, and it ended up being 10-hour turnarounds for 3 weeks. I was very tired, and I never got a chance to really regain, but like any protective animal, you do what you do with the resources that you have. And because David had those considerations, i.e., we can't make mistakes, we have to do it 2 takes, 2 takes, 2 takes, let's go, let's move, this is a wrap, next setup, etc. So we were going forward at a quick pace. And because of that, and because the script wasn't completely finished, and Patrick McGowan, who's a brilliant, brilliant man who internalizes much more than even what is on the page, which is what makes him great, was internalizing excessively.
Why are you such a derelict, such a piece of human junk?
His misgivings and misunderstandings of the science fiction aspect of it, which I don't know whether it was misunderstandings or it just wasn't clear enough to Patrick where we were going, so he was mistrustful of the process. And I remember one time we were in the Winnebago running lines, and he says, I just don't understand where this is going. And I said, Patrick, he said, this is meaningless to me, meaningless. Of course, I didn't know how to tell him what it meant because I didn't know either, but, you know, I figured it was going to work out because I had confidence in David stitching this Frankenstein monster together, of which I was a limb. That scene where I'm on the bed, and I think maybe he had taken some medicine or something like that, I don't know, but there was a medicinal smell, and he was going to inject me. And I'm on the bed, and of course, my mind is not exactly dormant, even though I was exhausted. And I'm smelling this medicine, and he's about to shoot me up, and I'm thinking, oh my God, David doesn't like my work. And McGowan is going to be the unwitting vector of my death. I love a good director. They are ruthless. The special effects and the foam rubber stuff, that's only a third of the brilliance of Dick Smith. He's a master. So what turns me on is his master aspect, his competence and everything. Now, he was a nervous wreck. When I say a nervous wreck, I mean he's under a lot of pressure. He's got a crew hanging around and everything's got to work and he's doing things and it's his art and he's proud and all of this jazz. And when we first met, I didn't have a clue who Dick Smith was. All I was told was, oh, the scenes of the final fight aren't good and, you know, like one of the things that we had to do was to finish up the film by a certain date, and so we had this after shoot. But no one told me the importance of it. As far as I was concerned, after working 6 weeks on Scanners and 8 weeks on another movie, that's 14 weeks back to back, 6 weeks of which were 10-hour turnarounds, excuse me, and the shooting, by the way, of Scanners, the interiors in Consec and stuff like that, I'll bet you can see people's breath in the interiors. That's how cold the set was, okay? The Canadian government gave the film industry a wharf in Montreal, same latitude as Moscow, God bless it. Politically different, but the same latitude as Moscow. And so on this wharf, unheated, was where the interior sets were built for Scanners. End of the fiscal year, is that like December, anybody? Fucking Santa Claus wouldn't have landed on that set. So now it was time for the shoot, so everything was good, and we're doing the thing, and all of a sudden, his prosthetics, his appliances aren't working. And I said, what's, I hear them all chattering and running around, and I'm there in the chair waiting to be like done, and I'm like gagging myself. So what's the problem? Well, he can't get pressure. Why can't you get pressure? Well, there's a leak. And I go, well, if there's a leak, and it's rubber, and it's small, get a pail, fill it with water, put the air through the apparatus, and see where the bubbles are, and that'll tell you where the leak is. Oh my God. Oh my goodness. It works. And they solved it. So the crew, everybody got to go back to work. And I was, for 2 brief seconds in that entire year-long experience, acknowledged for knowing something, because I could barely do the lines. And, well, there was only one line I couldn't do, and I'll get to that. So, you know, artists, you know, their greatness is their narrowness. David had some line that used the word metempsychosis. And it was some obscure Cronenberg reference to some kind of transcendental, God knows what, some mystical, theosophical movement or something. I have no idea what the fuck it was, and I didn't know how to pronounce it. And I'm reading it, and when you read a word like metempsychosis, and you make up your own pronunciation. And David, of course, is a very particular person. He wants things his way, David does. And I don't think he was happy with my pronunciations. No, Stephen, that's not how it's done. It's not how you say it. It's pronounced, and you know, directors have a way of not scolding you, but telling you you're so wonderful that you made this mistake. But I just want to kind of I want to have your foot in the shoe. So we're going to undo the laces and tie them up again, with your cooperation, of course. So I think we had over 14 takes. That kind of tension, that kind of adjustment, that kind of giving you something to resist against to polish your product makes a better product. At the time, I was the highest paid actor in the history of Canadian film on a Canadian project. Believe me, it was still 5 figures. Wasn't a big deal. And when am I getting paid? Like December 30th. So what are you going to do tax-wise? All of a sudden you've got this big lump and you're in the highest tax bracket, it's all going to be taken away. So it was put into what they call income averaging annuities, et cetera, et cetera. So I went from being very wealthy for 10 minutes to wealthy by my bohemian standards, you understand, not by any of the legitimate people who were making the movie, God bless them. And so my circumstances with the income averaging annuity, it gave me, you know, a very small amount of money for a very limited number of years. And back to the original question that you asked, which was how did you get involved in this in the first place? Because as an artist, I had free time, and they would come to me and they would say, well, what are you doing today, Steve? Well, what am I going to do today? I'm trying to get myself ready to put marks on a blank canvas. And they said, well, do you have time? And come down and help us with this. So helping people and getting a reaction and getting something documented was just as important as documenting my mark on a page at that time. Hanging out in the East Village about a year after Scanners was released, and I'm just talking with friends on some steps, and I look up and I go, what? They say, you. I know you. You're either a narc or a movie star. So, I mean, that's cool. I mean, I dug that. That was good. But, you know, I don't have the car double parked waiting to get me out of there if there's a problem. And to have that car there, you got to be working all the time. To be working all the time, I have to be reading other people's words, thinking, how am I going to please other people? And that's not where I wanted to go. So I've spent the years after Scanners pretty much staying away from the film industry, building up this body of paintings. I was real fortunate in that I was one of the founding creatures, artists, expressionists, whatever, of the East Village scene. And a lot of things grew out of that are, you know, tertiary results of that. Because I was painting before Scanners. I had 5 or 6 one-man shows before I did the films, and had shows in Germany at the Anne Friebe Gallery and some other places. And so all of a sudden I had an international career in painting. So that was just as rewarding, and I didn't have to show my face. That's why the directors have longer lives than the actors in most cases, because they aren't being looked at. And of course, they're in complete power positions. They employ people. The only people that most actors employ are bodyguards and gardeners and, you know, people to change their heads on their vibrators. God bless that industry.
His latest picture is Scanners. It's the first Canadian film ever to be #1 on the Variety box office chart. It's so far grossed over $12 million. And we're going to do a bit of a retrospect with the producer, the director, and the author of Scanners. Would you welcome David Cronenberg? Retrospective, I guess we could say. We're going to show clips from 4 of the movies. You've actually made 6, though, have you not?
7.
7 movies.
7,
what was the first movie you ever made, David?
Well, the first movie in the sense of feature film was called Stereo, and it was in fact about experiments in artificially created telepathy, which is basically what Scanners is about. One return to that.
One writer said that from Stereo you've always stayed on pretty well the same sort of theme. Do you agree with that?
In a very general way, I think yes, but in terms of if you looked at the plot summaries of these movies, you wouldn't see direct connections, I think. But when you see the film, there is a sensibility, I think, that definitely does go through all the films.
Well, you were going to be a writer when you were going to University of Toronto.
That's right.
What influenced you to move into film?
I saw a film called Winter Kept Us Warm, which is a film that was made at University of Toronto by a fellow named David Sector. And I was really quite shocked to see a film that had starred my friends, but actually was a real movie. It had never occurred to me before that I could make a film. And you know, my 8-year-old nephew has made 5 films already. I don't think we'll see that again. But I was in my 20s before it ever occurred to me that I had access to film.
Why did you choose the horror genre? Because according to all I've read, you were never into that type of a thing before.
It really chose me in the sense that when I've written all my own scripts, and when I sit down to write, whatever comes up on the page is what I feel compelled to do, and that's what comes out.
Well, now let's talk about Shivers, 75. Okay. What prompted this? This is the story of bugs coming out of people's insides and attacking people in an apartment building?
Yeah, actually, people who've seen Alien will find a few very familiar things and also altered states in this film, which I actually shot in 1974. But it's about a disease that spreads through a high-rise apartment building, and it's a very visible a disease and a very metaphysical one as well, and it causes people to become very crazy and sexually violent, but it also spreads from mouth to mouth and body to body, and it's about this long, actually. It's a nasty-looking thing.
All right, let's take a look at it. This is called Shivers. This goes back. This was your first big national distribution.
This was my first movie as opposed to film, let's say.
First movie as opposed to film. It's called Shivers.
It was just another high-rise apartment building until one day something went horribly wrong. Why are the residents committing uncontrollable acts of violence? Shivers. Being terrified is only the beginning. Remember, lock your doors, bar your windows, don't go down the stairway, don't get caught tonight. Shivers, the film shocker of the year.
That's Shivers. All right, that's 75.
Yeah.
Were you impressed with the way Shivers took hold?
Yes, actually, because I think it was one of the first really serious horror films ever made in Canada. There really had only been 2 or 3 done at all before Shivers. And it was very difficult to get the film financed as a result because, of course, there's a long history of horror filmmaking in the States and in Europe, but here there wasn't. And it's such a solid genre, one that's always there for various reasons.
What about Rabid, then? Where did the idea for that come from?
Well, Rabid, in a way, is a kind of a sequel to Shivers, not directly, but thematically, it goes from the high-rise apartment building out into the city. And it's about a woman who has accidentally created a kind of artificial, a kind of strange vampiress.
This starred Marilyn Chambers.
That's right, yes.
And the idea being that in order to survive, she had to suck the blood from people.
That's right, but didn't have to kill them. That was the thing.
I understand that because the English apparently have a bit of a thing about rabies, that this was extremely popular in Great Britain.
Well, I don't know if it was very popular in Hong Kong because it came out during a rabies epidemic in Hong Kong. And of course, the worst thing to do during a rabies epidemic is to pack theaters with yourself. But that's what happened. Everybody went to see this movie about and it's not really about rabies. It's about being rabid, which is metaphorically means, you know, insane and.
1977 Rabid, David Cronenberg's film.
Can't trust your mother, your best friend, the neighbor next door. 1 minute, they're perfectly normal. The next, Rabid. Pray
Pray it doesn't happen to you.
Pray it doesn't happen. Now, I understand that these films, Shivers and Rabid and The Brood, we're going to see that up in the next segment, have become cult films in Germany and in Great Britain.
Well, they've even broken out now in the U.S. because of the success of Scanners. In the current Newsweek, there's an article on me and my films, and in that, Jack Kroll calls The Brood a horror classic. And it's nice to see it beginning to get recognized in North America as well. But for many years, these films have been very well thought of in England.
All right, we're going to come back with David Cronenberg. We have 2 more clips from 2 more of his movies. Then we're going to talk about why he isn't recognized for what he is at home after this timeout. David Cronenberg's our guest, Canada's master of horror, Canada's baron of blood, and a cult figure throughout the world. We have talked about Shivers and Rabid. What about The Brood, 79? Where did that come from, that idea?
Well, The Brood was the first film that I've done that was, I would say, was reasonably autobiographical. I know it may sound strange to do a horror film that's autobiographical.
Now, let's see. The story was the woman had a womb on the outside of her body in which children were created that would do her bidding. If the mother wanted these children to kill, they killed, and they grew up very swiftly too.
They were meant to be the incarnation of her anger against her life and her family and a lot of other things, and so that's not the part that's autobiographical, really. See, you know. No. But it begins. I like to say that The Brood is my version of Kramer versus Kramer, only it's more realistic. Because it is about a custody battle over a child between a man and a woman who have separated, and it begins very straightforwardly that way, and then it sort of edges over into Nightmare.
All right, let's take a look at this particular clip. This is 1979, and this is The Brood. I don't know what the clip is. This is the only clip I haven't seen, so we'll see what part of The Brood we have. Watch.
They come from the unknown. They're here now, hiding, ready to strike. You can feel their presence all around you. Once unleashed, they destroy anyone who gets in their way. David Cronenberg's The Brood. They're waiting for you.
All right, there's The Brood. We were watching that. I recognized Nilda Fitzgerald. Do you use mostly Canadian actors and actresses?
Yes, we usually have 1 or possibly 2 foreign actors in a film. Not necessarily American. Patrick McGowan and Jennifer O'Neill are in Scanners. Oliver Reed and Samantha Egger in The Brood. But basically, out of a cast of 50, you have about 48 Canadians.
Now, The Scanners has just taken off. Is it that much better a film than Shivers or The Brood or Rabid, or is it because people are becoming used to David Cronenberg's style?
I think a lot had to do with the kind of distribution Scanners got in the States. And there was something about it that just caught everyone's imagination. The idea of a kind of telepathy, and these scanners are telepathists who do nasty things to each other.
I understand that when you were previewing the show, was it in San Diego?
Mm-hmm.
The start of the film had a head blowing up.
That's right, yeah.
And one of the critics fainted, and three of them had to be
That's
taken
right. She
away
never
from the
got
room.
to see the rest of the movie. It was terrible. Except 37 people fainted the first time Rabid was shown in Quebec, actually. So, you know, I guess I'm getting more subtle.
Did you did you take the blown up head off the opening of it and move it back farther in the picture?
Yes, but that was really had to do with the pacing of the film. You normally do a preview to get an idea of how the audience is responding to the film, and you shift a few things around. There was a slow spot in the middle, and by moving that down, it sort of eliminated that.
Where did you get the idea for the scanners?
Scanners? Well, it really comes from a kind of adolescent fantasy of power, I think, that you go to bed powerless and weak, and you wake up finding out that you actually have some special power that was undiscovered in you before.
Watch The Power right now with Stephen Lack and Michael Ironside. Oh,
yeah, well, that's short but sweet, I guess.
Yeah, we didn't see the blood vessels all coming out. What are you working on now, David?
I'm writing a script called Videodrome, which I don't even myself know exactly what is. I don't know what the ending is. I'm only on page 72. And if the script develops well, we'll be shooting that in Toronto in October.
What do your children think of Daddy being a horror movie director and writer?
Well, my daughter's seen all my films, and she loves them. And she brings friends home to watch them on cassette. I insist on getting notes from their parents, though, saying it's okay, I don't want any lawsuits.
Well, David, you're going to be a presenter at this Thursday's Genie Awards for the Best Director?
That's right. I'm quite happy to be part of the show, finally, because I've been a bit of an outsider in the Canadian film business for a while, and it's nice to I'll actually rent a tuxedo.
We look forward to seeing David Cronenberg at the Genie Awards at Royal Alec, and of course, I think we should have a retrospective of his films soon in Canada, very shortly.
I'm ready.
And David Cronenberg's ready, and we're ready too. Thank you, David, for being with us. Pleasure.
Now that we have some insight into the concept of experiential space, we may consider interaction among the experiential space continua of a highly unique group of individuals. In general, the study of the varying dimensions of human experience in the context of man in his society is known as human social cybernetics. In our experiment, 8 Category A subjects underwent pattern brain surgery, whose program was developed within the Academy's organic computer dialectic system. The object of surgery was to extend by a process called biochemical induction the natural electrochemical network of the human brain. This extension would provide each subject with telepathic capabilities. A telepathist is one who can communicate with other minds by means which do not involve perception by the senses. Thus, telepathy is a form of extrasensory perception, or ESP. Our subjects were to be kept in isolation at the Institute for 3 months, where they were to prepare for their first meeting as a group. This meeting was to take place at the Academy Sanatorium in the Ontario North Woods.
Telepathic dependency is an extreme form of psychic addiction. It is essentially an electrochemical addiction, the dependent surrendering the autonomy of his own nervous system to that of the object of his dependency, and altering his patterns of electrochemical discharge to mimic those of his object. When the object of dependency is telepathically unavailable for long periods of time, the new nervous patterns find themselves suddenly without a constant source of electromorphological reinforcement, and severe psychic disorientation begins to manifest itself in the dependent. At its most intense level, a frustrated dependency can result in the irreversible destruction of critical brain tissue. Inasmuch as the establishment of a partial telepathic dependency of the subject upon his researcher is an unavoidable part of the parapsychological experimental gestalt, the means to maintain this dependency at a controllable level must be considered an organic element forming that experimental gestalt. During the institute phase of the induced telepathy series, a subject possessed of a statistically excessive dependency susceptibility quotient wounded himself in the forehead with a hand drill. The wound, a hole about 1/2 an inch in diameter, completely penetrated the subject's skull and seemed to afford him the relief of imagined cranial pressures, temporary euphoria, and electrochemical dissociation, which he sought.
It will perhaps clarify these matters if we consider the specific configuration of the Category A subject. Category A is a classification which finds its meaning within the scientific metaphysics of the aphrodisiast and theorist Luther Stringfellow. It is not what is usually considered an objective classification based, for example, upon physical or psychological characteristics. Category A is rather a certain field reaction of the researcher to an intensive period of personal interaction with each of his potential subjects. There is also, therefore, the element of an aesthetics of human form in the Category A system of subject classification. Dr. Stringfellow made his name as an exponent of the existential organic approach to the sciences long before his work in the sociochemistry of the erotic achieved its present international eminence. The Category A classification is the existential organic methodology put into practice. Dr. Stringfellow has repeatedly stressed the vital necessity for the use of this approach, particularly in the new social sciences, where variables are infinite and complexity is of the highest possible order. The nature of erotic research requires that the sexual emotional involvement of the researcher with each subject be taken to its farthest possible extreme. It is only in this way that the researcher, in whose consciousness the total mosaic of his particular research project exists, can divine in each of his subjects a color, a texture, and a shape, and so assign to that subject his proper place in the research mosaic.
It was hoped that many important questions would be clarified, if not answered, during the course of our experiment with induced telepathy. 2 of the 8 subjects consented to having portions of their larynx removed, making it physically impossible for them to speak. In addition, large portions of the speech centers of the brains of these subjects were obliterated, so that the psychological faculty of speech itself would be impaired. Would the maturing and strengthening of the telepathic capacity in these speechless subjects surpass that of the subjects who still retained the ability to speak? It was anticipated that the telepathic experience would be much more than simply reading another's mind. One telepathist would perhaps be able to apprehend not only verbal patterns as they arose within the mind of another, but would also encounter simultaneously the germinative layers of memory, learning, emotional response, and psychophysiological impulse, which actually generate thought and language. How dependent upon language is thought? Is abstract, logical thought even possible without language?
The essence of the telepathic bond is the dominance of one of the particles forming the telepathic conglomerate. Whether the conglomerate consists of 2 telepathists or of a large, socially cohesive group, the principle of psychic dominance remains constant. The dominant personality is responsible for the suppression of the heterogeneous elements which the conglomerate comprises. The homogeneous elements which remain are then driven together to form the conglomerate by the laws of telepathic bonding implicit in the Stringfellow hypothesis. The principle of dominance thus provides the agglutinizing impetus which induces the initial conglomerative motion. As Stringfellow notes in defining the nature of dominance, the will of the newly formed conglomerate must necessarily be a function of the will of the dominant personality. Only after an indefinite period of symbiotic telepathic cohesion can the dominant personality abdicate its agglutinative role and encourage the emergence of a truly synthetic conglomerate personality. Stringfellow's behavior as parapsychologist suggests that perhaps his foremost post-operative research objective was to intuit which among his Category A subjects was the one most capable of assuming the role of psychic dominant. This subject was then provided indirectly with certain historical and interpretive data concerning his fellow subjects. This data would naturally assure the immediate social dominance of the chosen subject within the context of the experimental, socially isolate gestalt. The function of the dominant would then be to select from among his fellow subjects the one psychically most vulnerable, and by the application of subtle social intimidations, followed by a careful series of potent symbolic gestures, draw this subject into the field of his psychotelepathic dominance. Once a true conglomerate, exhibiting complete telepathic bonding has been established between this primary couple, the progression towards a larger and more complex conglomerate may begin.
In psychic research, the emotional distance between the researcher and his subject is inevitably diminished until it is no more than the distance between any two persons. The acquiescence of the subject to the demands of the researcher becomes nothing more nor less than an individual act of faith, of love. If there can be no love between researcher and subject, there can be no experimentation. In conventional theories of scientific methodology, an experiment proves its validity when it can be universally repeated in every aspect. In psychic research, such an approach is completely untenable. The existential circumstances of any experiment in parapsychology are inextricably mixed with the individuals and the phenomenological sets involved in that particular experiment, and cannot be abstracted from those individuals or phenomenological sets. The conditions of experiments in parapsychology are unique, non-uniform, and non-repeatable. A completely non-scientific burden is therefore placed upon the researcher, for if the personal relationship between researcher and subject deteriorates, the experiment cannot continue along its natural course. The sensitivity of the experimental parapsychological plexus demands new methods to help maintain the emotional momentum of certain experiments. It will be noticed that the motto of the Canadian Academy for Erotic Inquiry has immediate relevance for the Stringfellow-induced telepathy series, Amor Vincit Omnia, or Love conquers all.
We understand that the unique way in which an individual perceives and reacts to his environment is a function of his own experiential space continuum. When object events enter the experiential space continuum of that individual, they become an integral organic part of that space. They are actually changed, qualitatively modified in accordance with the creative nature of that space. But we are now dealing with telepathists. In theory, the experiential space continua of two or more telepathists can merge, can blend together to an extent far beyond the range of normal human experience. What would be the organic nature of communal experiential space shared among 8 psychosomatic entities? Would one person, one mode of perception and reaction, one experiential space continuum dominate this oversoul? Or would each mind participate in the synthesis of a uniform, newly created emergent space, unlike any of its constituents? How would the physical and social functioning of members of this group be altered? Or could they function in recognizable modes at all?
There is some evidence to suggest that potential telepathic intensity varies indirectly as the square of the distance between two telepathists. An increase in physical distance may therefore be used by one telepathist as an effective defense against telepathic intrusion on the part of another telepathist. A far more sophisticated intrusion avoidance device, known as schizophonetic partition, was evolved by one of the female subjects during the group isolation sanatorium phase. In order to subvert attempts by fellow subjects to establish a potentially intrusive telepathic rapport, she completely separated her telepathic non-verbal self from her oral verbal self. The telepathic self functioned as a false self, diverting fellow telepathists from the real or true self, which manifested itself only in occasional, deliberately confused verbal utterances. She thus protected her true self from telepathic intrusion by abandoning her telepathic faculty to a false self. Not surprisingly, repeated telepathic probes undertaken by other subjects could not discover the true nature of her experiential space continuum. The danger inherent in the use of schizophonetic partition as a telepathic intrusion avoidance device is that the false telepathic self tends to become increasingly parasitic on the true oral verbal self. The true self begins to suffocate inasmuch as it is starved of contact with the outside, and the false self gradually becomes the only self to interact with other selves. In the instance of our female schizophonetic subject, the true self began to express its moribund existence through the telepathic emission of violent images of decay, vampirism, disintegration, and necrophilia, which sporadically interrupted the functioning of the telepathic false self. The intensity and frequency of this emission of morbid telepathic images rapidly increased until it began to create the same depressed mode in those close to her.
Another important function of our experiment was to be the practical testing of the Stringfellow hypothesis. The Stringfellow hypothesis takes the form of the following equation. The rate of telepathic flow between two minds is directly proportional to the intensity of the relationship between the two minds. The units used to measure flow and intensity are taken from psychochemistry. In less mathematical terms, we may say that this hypothesis indicates that even between mature telepathists, there can be no telepathic communication until some sort of existential, emotional relationship has been established in conventional sensory ways. Thus, among complete strangers, there would exist only a kind of noise, a short wave static. The Stringfellow hypothesis also suggests that here the potency of human eroticism would play an important role. A strong sexual attraction would be a substantial basis for the establishing of a geometrically increasing rate of telepathic flow. .
The politics of experience on the level of individuals is a correlative of the politics of social groups. The politics of telepathic experience may be studied as a projection of the power struggles among individuals into the extremities of psychic potency and complexity, a projection, that is, into the future of human social evolution.
The role of the induced telepathy series in the total Canadian social experiment is theoretically secure. That role emerges out of Dr. Stringfellow's concept of the telepathic commune, a group characterized by the blending of experiential space continua and the constant, instantaneous exchange of data among the nervous systems forming the commune. Stringfellow indicates that at the most basic structural level, the telepathic unit, which emphasizes acts of faith and love, seems the most plausible replacement for the obsolescent family unit. The communal telepathic experience, translated into the larger social national context, would presumably carry with it its intrinsic qualities of willing reciprocal dependency and mutual experiential creativity. The social responsibility of telepathic prototypes is therefore of the utmost gravity, for it is only by their individual efforts that the creation of the first and most critical telepathic communes can be realized.
For those of exponentially maturing telepathic capacities, the question of phenomenological refinement must inevitably become one with the problem of the internalization of the sensory. The telepathist faces the obsolescence of the senses and the possible atrophy of the human sensorium in all but its most mundane operations. During a certain phase in the telepathist's evolution, the sensory will attempt to internalize to avoid its extinction on the level of intellectuality and emotion. This avoidance could take two forms. One would be the forced psychic ingestion of the entire universe as conveyed in terms of sensory information. This would partially manifest itself in the instantaneous translation into the vocabulary of the sensory of all purely psychic, abstract, or extrasensory phenomena. Second form of avoidance would be the reification of the psychic, the abstract, or the extrasensory, and its subsequent externalization or projection. The process begun by this objectification and displacement of the non-sensory would find a point of equilibrium and complete itself only with the indiscriminate return or internalization of both the projected non-sensory information and its sensory screen, the passive external world as perceived by the senses. In both instances, the distinction between the sensory and the non-sensory, the concrete and the abstract, the psychic and the physical, would be lost utterly.
These opposite poles of human sexuality are traditionally held to be heterosexuality and homosexuality. Yet this same dipolar structure of sexuality is ignored when the question of normality and deviation arises. The norm is taken to be heterosexuality, and both bisexuality and homosexuality are considered deviations from that norm. The primary justification for the normality of heterosexuality is reproduction. Only a heterosexual relationship can, as yet, result in regeneration. This argument collapses, however, once it is demonstrated that the sexuality involved in reproduction represents only a very small, almost accidental segment of the total human sexual spectrum. Academy research has established that both heterosexuality and homosexuality are equally what might be termed perversions relative to the potential human sexual field. In this context, the true norm is an expanded form of bisexuality, which we term omnisexuality. As an aphrodisiast, Dr. Stringfellow proposes the use of synthetic aphrodisiac drugs to assist those who wish to attain a fully three-dimensional sexuality. The proper use of psychic aphrodisiacs, such as those being developed by Dr. Stringfellow at the Canadian Academy for Erotic Inquiry, is not to increase sexual potency or fertility, but to demolish the walls of psychological restraint and social inhibition which restrict persons to a monosexuality or to a stunted bisexual form of omnisexuality. The telepathist, then, by virtue of the omnisexual nature of his experiential space continuum, may readily be seen to be the possible prototype of three-dimensional man.
Certain unexpected results, however, threw the future of the project into doubt. When preliminary confrontations between any two subjects were arranged, the subjects not only reported no instances of telepathic communication, but quite emphatically avoided even the most casual sensory contact with each other. At the same time, electroencephalographic probes indicated that such telepathic communication as was denied by the subjects was in fact taking place, and at a remarkably high rate of flow. How could such flow exist among strangers? In an emergency program modification, 5 of our 8 subjects were combined in an enforced community study. These 5 subjects, although psychochemically the least volatile of the group, almost immediately retreated into a state of self-encapsulation. refusing to communicate in any way with either researchers or each other. Before further investigations could be made, 2 of the 5 subjects committed suicide in their residences at the Institute. Another pierced his skull with an electric drill, an act of considerable symbolic significance. Careful separation of the remaining subjects was maintained.
The study of human erotic morphology deals more directly with this question. Morphology is the study of form and structure. Erotic morphology is the study of those forms which evoke an erotic or sexual response when they are perceived or otherwise communicated. Not only the shape of objects or body parts, but also the morphology of motion, of movement in certain patterns, can convey erotic signals of a very complex nature. Finally, the combination of shape plus motion can attain an erotic significance which is contained in neither shape nor motion when taken separately. But the telepathist does not have to perceive a breast or thigh or sexual motion directly. He can apprehend the thought of a breast, thigh, or erotic motion in the mind of another telepathist, and this thought is received with greater impact than the perception of the actual breast, thigh, or erotic motion would itself have been. Thus, although both telepathists in our hypothetical confrontation are male, they have made an erotic morphological communication which is essentially heterosexual, or male-female. We can begin to see why the telepathic experience is essentially omnisexual in nature, why the male-female bisexual categories can no longer apply.
In the sanatorium phase of the induced telepathy series, measures were introduced to prevent further instances of interruption caused by frustrated telepathic dependency. A single compact electromagnetic receiver transmitter was provided for the subjects undergoing primary group isolation. The receiver transmitter was to feed the subjects reproductions of a variety of patterns of electrochemical discharge unique to Dr. Stringfellow, the group's common researcher. The purpose of these transmissions from the Institute was to ease the difficult transition from the inevitable telepathic dependency established individually between Stringfellow and each subject to a group telepathic cohesion and a group telepathic autonomy. The necessity of sharing the transmitted electrochemical patterns, either through the sharing of the receiver transmitter itself, or the telepathic sharing of the experience of receiving the patterns, would provide a basis for the formation of a telepathic commune, which did not depend upon Stringfellow as a psychic cluster nucleus. Dr. Stringfellow indicated that he himself entered a severely depressive psychological mode upon separation from the induced telepathy group, an event suggesting that, to some extent, telepathic dependency functions reciprocally, even between telepathists and non-paranormals.
Five intensive months of work with the remaining subjects revealed ways to gradually increase the tolerance among them for group exposure. It was found that the telepathic experience was likely to be an overwhelming and extremely exhausting one, verging on pain and hallucination. The most crucial problem for the telepathist, apparently, was to develop within himself the means to control and modulate the rate and quality of telepathic flow between himself and another. The inexperienced telepathist simply cannot cope with the complexity and effort involved in the social telepathic situation. The first meeting of all the subjects as a group took place at the Academy Sanatorium somewhat later than originally planned. The sixth subject arrived 2 weeks after the others, when it was certain that he had fully recovered from his self-inflicted violence. It will be some time before the data on this period, accumulated through electroencephalographic information retrieval, can be fully evaluated.